Well, it's time to look at another classic album from one of my favorite bands. 2020 hasn't been the greatest year for new music, so I've been spending a lot of time deep diving into some of my some really classic albums, and I want to talk about it. So let's go. Going for the One by Yes. So this one is a really fun album, and one that I kind of really like the history of. I believe they just kind of went to Holland or the Netherlands or something like that and just kind of like created music in almost like a musical retreat. I know that like coming together as a band and writing music for Yes was always kind of a tumultuous and turbulative pastime and endeavor, but Going for the One was just kind of like meh. And we have Rick Wakeman back on the keyboards, kind of solidifying one of my favorite lineups of the band. Not quite, again, I wish Bill Bruford was on this, but Alan White still does a fantastic job behind the kit. So we've got Steve Howe on lead guitars, Chris Squire on rhythm and bass and backup vocals, John Anderson on vocals, and Rick Wakeman on the keyboards there, and of course Alan White on drums. So this is one of my favorite lineups of Yes, and honestly this is the last classic album from the band. I think that from even though I love the first two albums, in my mind the classic set of the Yes discography starts from the Yes album and goes right up into Going for the One. There are albums that came out after that that I still love, but like this was the peak. This was the heyday. And I really feel like Going for the One put a perfect punctuation to that run. And I love a lot of the different sounds that we have on this album and some of the different inflections. We definitely have the two really fun Pump Up the Jam songs. It starts off with one with the title track of Going for the One, with being just so jovial, so fun. The opening notes of Steve Howe's guitar work has that twangy flavor to it that has that really fun aspect. Even though when I first listened to this, outside of just being really interested and fun, I didn't get into it a whole lot, especially near the end when they just start going off for the one kind of an idea. I like how it kind of all comes together near the end. So it's got that driving force, it's got that Pump Up the Jam, everybody's really coming together. Rick Wakeman is back with a passion. His keyboard work, again, adds that whole new dynamic and new flavor to the album that, like, past keyboardists and future keyboardists have tried to kind of emulate, but they don't have that same kind of flair. They don't kind of have that same kind of flavor. And that's something that, again, just explodes off of Going for the One, the title track on this. And I think it's a really good way of opening up the album, because as much as I love Relayered, it is very chaotic and very experimental, whereas this, even though it is a little bit on the experimental side, it's less so. And they kind of start that off right off the get-go with this one being like, look, we don't have as much experimentation, we don't have so much balls to the wall insanity, we're going to bring it back down a little bit. And actually this is continued with one of my favorite tracks off of this album, Turn of the Century. This piece is heart-wrenching, and I love where this goes. You know, it starts off with Steve Howe's acoustic guitar set kind of starting us off, very much like a classical guitar starting it, and then Rick Wakeman comes in and just kind of breathes light slowly but surely into it. The harmonizations between John and Chris, again, create such a divine sense of sound on this. And I love the tail that we have. And I always kind of picture, and I think I might have said this on my live stream when I listened to this album, how within this particular piece, I always picture this like scene in my head if I were to orchestrate it like a music video, where there would be like two people walking by, and then this would go to like this masquerade where they were both there, and slowly within the instrumental piece of this track, and I love this instrumental piece, that's where Rick Wakeman's really coming in. We have a little bit of the bass line from Chris just to kind of provide a little bit of atmosphere and a little bit of a bottom, and it brings this huge crescendo where Steve is able to really belt it out on his guitar work. And so in that piece, we have these two dancers in this masquerade ball that slowly lift off the dance floor and just kind of like rocket up into the sky until we get to that big crescendo. They cross the clouds, and then it ends with that giant kind of release, that big crescendo, and dancing on the clouds, and that's where John comes back. and starts that singing style again. And we just have like this little bit of that camera sweep that we have a lot within those kind of visual dances. And then they're slowly brought back down. And then in the closing passages of this song, we're brought back to the two strangers on the street after they've passed. And they both just kind of turn and look at each other with this sign of recognition. And they both just kind of smile, and that's where the song ends. Turn of the Century is such a landmark track because nothing really close came before or after it. You know, it's one of those like gems within Yes's discography that has never really been emulated. Like the closest that I came was maybe Time and a Word from their second album. But since then, I can't think of anything that's kind of come close. Anyway, then we move into Parallels, and Parallels is probably the weakest of the tracks. I do love the big organ work that we have on this, and I'll talk a little bit more about the organ work from Rick when we get to Awaken. But that's really the only like point off of Parallels that I like. The rest of the song just doesn't feel all that original. It doesn't grab me all that well. It's kind of the weak point in the album. I'm not a big fan of Parallels. And I always wondered why they started off Yes Shows, the live album that would come out just after this album, why they led with this track, because I feel like it's one of Yes's weaker tracks, unfortunately. There's not a whole lot of originality to it. I'm not feeling all that fun. Like, I do enjoy Chris's bass line on this, and that's probably the highlight of that really prominent, chuggy bass off of it. But everything else just kind of slides into very easy territory, and something that I think is above Yes at this point. Anyway, then we come into Wondrous Stories, the second side of this album. It reminds me a little bit of Turn of the Century and Time in the World, where it's very ballady without getting over melodramatic. I love how innocent this track is, how jovial it is, how childlike it is. And this is something that I think they tried to recapture on Tornadoes a little bit with like the Circus of Heaven, but I feel like they really captured it with Wondrous Stories. It provides such a soothing and comforting track. Like, this is something that I'll put on when I just need a little bit of a release, a little bit of a kind of thing. I'll turn to Wondrous Stories. Then we come into the big track, the staple track, the 15.5-minute track of Awaken. The use of synthesizer blended with the organ, I think, is where this track shines. We're getting flavors of the past within this, like from, say, Close to the Edge and Relayer, with so much chaos in the beginning. Like, I love where we get into that really big meat of the track after we have John Anderson's singing passages with a little bit of Wakeman's keyboards kind of floating us along. Then we get this really heavy boom, like Howe's guitar work on there is still crisp and still insane. Like, to this day, like, I still get shivers whenever I hear that kind of passage. And then we get into that Chris kind of walking down and descending staircase into the big first climax and the plateau that we have on that within the first half of the song, where it brings it all together, very a la Close to the Edge. And that was something that Yes really perfected with this, that chaos, that resolution, the coming into this next plateau, and it brings us into this really beautiful passage. And then the song kind of tapers down, and then it builds itself back up, and it really takes its time building itself back up. And that's what I really particularly like, because it's that climb that makes us really appreciate that final crescendo that we have at the end part. We have John on the harp, again, really building that atmosphere on this track, really building the scene. I don't know, when it comes into this big oomph, we still have Steve Howe doing his first little inflections on the guitar, but what I love is how it takes its time to build itself up, and once it gets to that plateau, it waits just a bit, and then you have that boom. And when we have that big crescendo, it does feel like a build up and release, this wind up and pull when we get to that big crescendo. And that's where that deep organ just hammers it. And it's that classical organ, like something that we had from Bach, that really just gets you to your core, that they've never really recaptured when they play it live, because you have to have a grand organ in order to play that particular passage. It's the blending of that really meaty organ with the synthesizer over top that creates such a celestial, heavenly, angelic passage. And you need both in order to really get that. You really need that bottom organ in order to lift it even higher. And whenever they do this live, you just can't do that unless you're traveling with a full-on organ. So it always kind of bothers me whenever I'm listening to a live recording that it doesn't have that really oomph hit. And then finally, after that big crescendo, John Anderson's voice kind of comes over with a little bit of Rick Wakeman's playing style, just to kind of and the last little notes on the guitar and bass just kind of carry the song home, giving us enough time just to kind of breathe, just to kind of release. And it's for that particular point that I always feel like this is the last great album because of such a stark and perfect punctuation mark in their discography in that sense. Like, it's a great ending of all the albums that came before it. So yeah, overall, this is a really beautiful, brilliant album. And it's for that reason that Going for the One by Yes is an absolute masterpiece.
We're not worthy! We're not worthy! We're not worthy!
Normally, I would give this album, I love it with all my heart because of Parallels being that little bit of a smudge and an overall perfect diamond. But yeah, I think the rest of the songs that are around it and the context that it's in elevates it to that masterpiece status. So it just kind of sneaks by that way. So yeah, what did you guys think about this album of Going for the One? I mean, that's all I gotta say. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Let me know by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.